So we move into early June, and I think I've now lost track of quite how many weeks of lockdown we've had. The weather's been extraordinarily hot, as we all know, but despite the heat, or perhaps because of the heat, there are still some exceptional things to look at in the garden. And I'm holding down a branch here of Cornus kousa Satomi, or the proper name is Cornus kousa Miss Satomi, which was a Japanese bred form of Cornus kousa, which has particularly pink or red bracts. It also has wonderful red autumn coloration in the autumn foliage. But looking today, we tend to think of Cornuses as being either creamy white or white, having quite small bracts. And there are very few which actually start out pink and become darker as they get bleached in the sun. Quite a few Cornus kousa varieties end up going pink or a bit red as the bracts come to the end of their flowering cycle. But this one is a really good pink or red right from the start. And people call them flowers, but the actual flower is in the center, and this is merely a flower bract, or a bract which is designed presumably to attract insects to come to the center of the flower itself and to fertilize it. And we know that the fertilization works because this tree will grow those strange red rounded strawberry-like fruits which the squirrels like so much later on in the year. But I bent that branch down so you could see it a bit, but have a look at the rest of the tree. It tends to grow in tiers, and it grows best in full sun because you get the better colours. It has long distended branches, and this small tree is probably 20 years old. We're now going to move on and look at a much older plant, which is also Cornus kousa Satomi, but growing in a rather more shady situation, and you'll see how the colour doesn't work quite as well and isn't as impressive in shade as it is here in very full sun. So we'll just move on a little way and show you another Cornus kousa Satomi. So here's another Cornus kousa Satomi. This was planted in 1991 after the hurricane blew out this area, and you can very clearly see that the flowers are much paler where they're in shade, and you see the same spreading drooping effect, which is one of the features of these sorts of cornices. But if we back up a bit so that we can look to the top of the plant where it's catching the sun rather more, we see the same beautiful pink colour that we saw in the smaller plant earlier. At this time of the year in June, something quite as spectacular as this is sometimes hard to find, and I think maybe today or this week it's possibly the best thing in the garden the visitors can't see. So we're still on the subject of cornices, and this is a very different cornus, as you can readily see. It's actually an evergreen, whereas Cornus kousa Satomi was very much a deciduous species. This is Cornus capitata, which is evergreen. And although I say it myself, the flowers aren't normally quite as large as this, but it's spectacular to look at. When you look at the emerging flowers and the flower bracts, they're much smaller, but when they're full out, as they are down here, you see they're a good 2.5, almost 3 inches across. And what you're just starting to see is these lovely creamy bracts turning a bit pink at the edges. There's another one there that's just beginning to show pinkishness. And in time you'll see a bit more pink come. Nothing like we saw on Miss Satomi. But here you've got a much more upright bush. This species has been in this country since 1825. It's not a great grower except in the milder parts of the country. In a very cold winter it can get defoliated, which once or twice doesn't cause it any grief, but further in the north of the country it might not do so well, might struggle. It has a very different growth habit, as you can see, and it comes from China and the Himalayas, where it's quite a common plant. And you see the centers of the flowers. These will turn into the most gigantic strawberry fruits, and they're shaped, you can see what the shape of the fruit will be, but the fruit will be that big. One of those gigantic strawberries that you definitely wouldn't want to eat unless you were a squirrel, but they do look very attractive, and the fruits only come ripe in late October, early November, whereas the fruits on many of the other cornuses are over and have dropped by then. So Cornus capitata is perhaps not as well known as Cornus kousa, but looking at it here today, it's a really stunningly attractive small tree, which makes a good backdrop to a herbaceous border and would look nice at the end of your garden if you've got room. So we tend to think of Aesculus or conker trees as flowering in May, but actually there are a couple of species that flower later in June, and this is the very rare Aesculus wilsonii, which is one of the last Aesculus to flower. And you can see here individual flower heads have got different colours. Some are yellow and some are red. And at first I was under the impression that maybe one flower was male and one flower was female. But actually what happens is that the flowers start off with a bit of a yellow centre. And then when they've been fertilised by a bee or an insect, and when they're more mature, they turn sort of pinky red, as here. So you've got one or two flowers right at the bottom, which have still got plenty of yellow, and one or two right at the top, which have still got plenty of yellow. But most of them it's been out for a few days, and they've now turned red and pink. And you notice the leaf structure, very pointed leaves in splays of 5 segments on each leaf, a very distinct shape. And this rare species first came into the country in 1908, and there's an original plant which we'll go and look at, which is coming towards the end of its life, certainly on its last legs, and not flowering very much. And as an old plant, it hasn't seeded for years, but younger plants grown from seed when it did seed are now taking its place. And this is one of them. This is about 35 years old. They take maybe 8 or 10 years to flower, but when they do, it's a much more spectacular show than your average conker tree. There's one other species called Aesculus chinensis, which also flowers very late and has similar flowers but slightly different leaves, and the two are quite easily confused. But anyway, just take in this tree, and there's another smaller one standing just behind us, and you can see that they're really quite floriferous. And for a tree which has a beautiful summer flowering performance like this, it's quite rare in that sense too, because there really aren't that many. Well worth a place in the garden. It's quite slow growing by chestnut standards, but a very fine and very rare thing. And fortunately now we've got lots of young trees which are producing conkers, so the nursery has got plenty of these seedlings coming along, and certainly the species is pretty safe from extinction down in Cornwall or at Caerhays anyway. We'll now pop and look at the old mature tree to complete this little pastiche of odd and unusual plants flowering in June. So this is the original 1908 Aesculus wilsonii. It's probably 70 feet tall, and it's certainly a UK record tree. It's flowering much more intensively than I expected it to, and unless we get some rain soon, this might be one of its last great shows. It's looking decidedly ancient and on the way out. But before we get too morose about it, we'll just stop a minute and go in and have a look at the wonderful peeling bark or flaking bark that it has. So in maturity, the bark literally flakes off each year. As the tree and the trunk expands, so the old bark flakes off quite naturally to create this rather nice sort of mottled effect. A few woodlice hiding away there. But if you look up these individual trunks, which there are 6 on this tree, you see the flaking bark goes right up to the crown of the tree, and is another unusual feature. I don't think any other Aesculus species that I know of has bark which has this peculiar characteristic. As you can see, the ground around about is quite naturally covered with bits that have dropped off already. And in nature, there's always something different. Quite why this tree does this, I don't really know, but I bet there's a perfectly good reason when it's growing in the wild in a mountain in the Himalayas. Anyway, a wonderful thing.